Hey all, and welcome back to Fuzzy Dutchy Gaming and a new video on the channel going through the Tornado Shot skill gem and how it works and how to scale it. The reason for the video is I've brought quite a few guides out in the last year about Tornado Shot, and more people are starting to follow them, and I'm getting a ton of questions on Discord, in YouTube comments, with very basic questions about Tornado Shot that unfortunately I just don't have the time to answer them all, probably because I end up answering the same questions over and over again. So what I thought would be more helpful is bring a video out going through how Tornado Shot works and how it scales, so that then when you look at gear and trees, you understand why I'm taking certain things. So we're going to start off with a very basic Tornado Shot gem. So this is a character that is a melee character, so he has nothing spec'd into projectiles other than a bit of crit because it was a lightning strike character. I've just put a standard ivory bow with nothing on it and a level 1 Tornado Shot. So firstly, we're going to go through the gem and explain how it works and its base function. So it fires one arrow that pierces. It pierces indefinitely. So it will pierce 10 targets if there's 10 or 1 if there's 1. And it won't explode until it hits the targeted location from your cursor. And so we can see we can fire it there. It will explode. You can see the round circle there. We can fire it up there. It will explode. And then what it does is it releases 3 secondary projectiles. These projectiles can hit enemies. Your piercing projectile can hit an enemy. We're going to go through the interaction with what can hit what enemy a bit later on. But essentially, this is how bad Tornado Shot is if you just put a level 1 skill gem in. No support, no extra arrows, no projectile speed. So the next important thing to note, and we're going to talk about, is projectile speed. So it does 2 things for Tornado Shot. It obviously makes it quicker. Like, this is dreadfully slow. I don't know if how you could fire an arrow that slow and it actually go through the air. But projectile speed is obviously needed because you don't want to have to wait half a second for your projectile to hit an enemy. The second reason it's important is it affects the travel distance of your secondary projectiles. So you can see here, when we're firing sort of on this ledge, our secondary projectiles are sort of not even getting to these stairs here. If I just put in a quiver with 74% projectile speed and then we hit the same target, we can now see that the projectiles are starting to come close to me and a bit further on. So the more projectile speed you can get, not only will it obviously improve the performance of the skill because your arrows are going to fly around a lot quicker, it's going to mean your secondary projectiles go further. That's important for 2 reasons. 1, it gives you the opportunity to screen wide clear. B, because you should always be running some sort of chain on Tornado Shot, it gives that chained projectile an opportunity to go and hit another enemy. So there is no maximum projectile speed. You can never have too much projectile speed on Tornado Shot. It's absolutely insane, and it's honestly the thing that makes the build feel the most comfortable. We're going to come back onto projectile speed in a bit because there's another few important interactions to talk about. But what we're going to go on to next is number of arrows. Now, this may be a bit geeky, and if I lose you, I apologize, but I want to be as thorough as possible. So I've stuck in a greater multiple projectiles into this skill. And all it says is it's going to fire more projectiles, but they're going to do less damage. On the surface of it, for any other bow skill, GMP is not something you want to put on if you want to do single target damage. Tornado Shot is different, and I'm going to try and explain why. So the way GMP works is it will give you more arrows, but each arrow essentially is still the same arrow. So only one arrow will damage one target. So if we were to just concentrate on the piercing arrows, even though we might pierce an enemy with 5 of these projectiles, only 1 of these is going to hit. However, your secondary projectiles work different because they're not technically getting any benefit from GMP because they've still got the 3 secondary projectiles. So the way I understand they work, unless it's changed, is that for each arrow you have, it's then going to fire 3 secondary projectiles. And because these are technically now separate, each arrow that's fired can hit with 1 of its secondary projectiles onto the same target. So let's say I hit the perfect shot and I go up here and 1 secondary projectile from every arrow hits me, I get damaged 5 times. If 3 of them hit me, I get damaged 3 times. However, I don't think you can do damage with the same group of secondary projectiles. I mean, it's very difficult to anyway, because 1 will fire up there, 1 down here and 1 down there. But let's say you had a boss that was this big. If you had 1 arrow and you hit with 2 secondary projectiles, I'm pretty sure it only does 1 amount of damage. I may be wrong, but in most cases, you're never going to hit with more than 1 of your secondary projectiles from 1 arrow anyway, because they go in totally different directions. And that's why arrows are important. And as I said, GMP, yes, it gives you less projectile damage, but it gives us 4 extra projectiles. So although we might lower our damage from, let's say, 100 to 20 to 74, we can now, instead of hitting an enemy once, we can hit it 5 times. So essentially, that's going to be like 300 to 400 damage compared to our previous damage of 100. Now, you may not hit with every projectile, and you're very unlikely to, but you will hit with at least half of your projectiles in most cases. So even though GMP says it does less damage, overall it does per projectile, but having an additional 4 projectiles means you're going to hit an enemy and certainly a boss with more than 1 projectile. And then the next thing to come on to, and the last thing around the skill itself, is chain, and why it's super important, because it's going to basically double your clear speed. So let's say we move back to my character who is actually a proper tornado shot character. You're going to see that once your end game built and you've got, say, 9, 10, 11 arrows, you're going to see how many secondary projectiles fly around the screen. And all it takes is for one to hit an enemy, and it's then going to chain and auto-target another enemy. Without chain, if you get lucky and these hit an enemy, then that's it. The projectile goes no more, it finishes an impact, and it hits the enemy, that's it. Whereas with this, I've got these projectiles flying around everywhere in a map. As soon as one hits an enemy, it's going to chain and hit another enemy, which is why it's massively important to get as many projectiles as you can and as many secondary projectiles as you can, alongside having chain or fork. And then along with that, we'll just go over Deadeye. I would never play Tornado Shot unless it's some sort of cast on crit thing. If you're playing pure Tornado Shot, there's no way you can beat a Deadeye. You get chain built in, which you can't get anywhere other than a skill gem. You get Ricochet, which is absolutely insane. We're going to come on to that in a minute. You get Fast Shot, only place you can get it. Absolutely massively increases the damage. 2 extra projectiles for the Ascendancy, which again is huge. It might cost, the difference between a bow and a bow with 2 arrows could be 50 divine. So 2 projectiles is a very, very worthy and expensive passive point. You've got Gathering Winds to make you nice and quick. And then you've got Focal Point for Sniper's Mark. So Sniper's Mark seems like a sensible place to start. This is a mark I would never do without on a projectile build, and we'll run over why. So we have Sniper's Mark here, and just alone, it does 40% increased damage from projectile hits. That's a pretty big damage boost. We're also going to scale that up with things like Focal Point, and then we're going to go down here on the tree. You can take like these nodes here that add effect. You can get a Mastery that adds effect. So you end up getting a huge effect on Sniper's Mark. Now, not only does that increase the damage, but the more effect you get, the more projectiles that actually fork off. So if we look again at the skill, we have projectiles which hit cursed enemies split towards 4 additional targets. However, with more and more effect, it can actually split towards 5 or 6. Now, whether this is going to do much is debatable, because you're only going to hit rare or unique enemies when you're running Mark on Hit. Where it's really handy is things like, I run City Square as my map. There's 3 bosses. I literally just have to kill one boss and the other ones die when that boss dies because of Sniper's Mark. So I'm hitting the boss, the 4 projectiles are splitting, and they're targeting nearby enemies, which is going to be the other 2 bosses. So we'll move on to Ricochet next. It's a node that's often overlooked by people. When they see Ricochet, they just see chain. They go, oh, chain, that'll be good for my clear speed. But projectiles having a 30% chance to chain when colliding with terrain is pretty insane. And I think that's why I get questions saying 1 minute I'm melting bosses, the next minute it's taking 6 to 7 seconds. I don't understand what's going on. And it's probably simply Ricochet and Sniper's Mark combined. So if you have a boss on his own in an open space, so let's take Final Form Lydia. She's a good example. She is in an arena that's raised off the ground. There is no walls and there is no enemies. You're not going to get any Ricochet. You're just going to have your projectiles. It's you against her and your Tornado Shot. However, when you look at an actual normal Sanctum room that might be something like this, you don't even have to be able to see enemies to kill them, because Ricochet will do it for you. So all you need to do is, an enemy's here, you stand here, you target the wall, and then 30% of your secondary projectiles are going to chain, and chain automatically targets an enemy. So you're going to wipe out enemies without even getting in any danger. Again, projectile speed, king, because the more you get, the further your arrows can go. And then I think the last thing to go through is the enchant. So it's often overlooked because maybe people don't quite understand how big this is. But because you mentioned, your actual arrows do no damage at all because they pierce automatically. You can only hit the same enemy once. It's literally, don't even count your actual arrows towards your DPS. because it's negligible. All your DPS comes from secondary projectiles. And as we've already gone through, each arrow you fire can hit with one of its secondary projectiles. If you're shooting out 4 instead of 3, that gives you a much better chance that one of your secondary projectiles will hit the enemy that you're aiming at. It's obviously going to be RNG and not guaranteed, but it is a massively increased chance to do single target damage and improve your clear speed, which is why it's an expensive enchant. On a decent base, it's multiple divines, and it's because it's a huge part of the build. It adds quality of life and it adds a lot of damage, and I don't think you could get that from anything else you did for one piece of gear or one skill gem or one node on a tree. This is absolutely huge. Now, you don't need 2 arrows on your bow. You don't need an arrow on the quiver. You don't need secondary projectile, but the more you get, the more comfy your build's going to feel and the more damage it's going to do. So I think that kind of covers the gem. So I'll just quickly summarize it. Projectile speed is king with Tornado Shot. Without it, the build feels ass, but it also provides benefits which interact with this mastery here. So increase and reductions to projectile speed apply to bow damage. So if we've got 300% projectile speed, we've got an extra 300% damage with bows. So you can not only look at projectile speed as quality of life and speed, you can look at it as damage. So whenever you see 20% projectile speed, you can also see 20% damage with bows. And it's also why this node works really well. On POB, these 3 nodes are probably not much. They're maybe 2.3% DPS per node. Not massive, but this node here is huge. It's 30% projectile speed, 30% projectile damage because we've got the mastery, and it also gives even more benefit to our arrows flying a long way. And the way projectile distance is measured is from when I fire it to the distance, not where the enemy is, but where the arrow travels. So if we look at far shot here, so far shot is projectile attack hits deal less damage to targets at the start of their movement, dealing up to 60% more damage to targets as the projectile travels further away. And all of your projectiles from your starting piercing projectile to your secondary projectiles are all classed as part of the same projectile. So even if the boss is standing here, I could shoot here and my projectile travel distance is that, which is probably about 120 in terms of in-game POB units. So it's not where you are or where the boss is, it's where your arrows have traveled. So if I had far shot and I stood here and I tried to hit the boss that was here, I would do decent damage because I'm shotgunning more, but I'm getting 20% less damage because I'm not benefiting from far shot. If I put my ballistas down and then I fire back here, you can see we're still getting quite a lot of projectiles returning directly to us, and we're going to get a massive effect from far shot and long shot coming back to us here that we're going to do an absolute ton of damage. And that again is why projectile speed is important. If you had slow projectile speed, it might take you a second for your projectiles to get there and back, in which time the enemy's already killed you. And I'm sure there's many other interactions that I might be missing, but I just wanted to go through the basic functions of the gem and try and keep it understandable to everyone, because you can go very specific with Tornado Shot and go off in all sorts of tangents and explain why X, Y, and Z is so good. But I just wanted to give people a video to refer to if they've just got no clue how the skill even functions. That's it for the video. Thanks for watching. Take care and see you in the next one.